A story is a promise. It's a promise that what you are about to hear matters, that it holds a truth you can carry with you long after the final word is faded. This is a story about a promise kept, but it begins with a single desperate act of kindness in the loneliest corner of a forgotten town. It's about a young waitress, so poor she had only $5 to her name, who used it to pay for a stranger's meal. It's about her 10-year-old brother, a boy who watched this small miracle and tucked it away in his heart. And when their world crumbled, when they were faced with eviction, sickness, and the cold indifference of the world, it was that boy who took that memory and walked into the heart of a storm, seeking the one man who looked like he could command thunder. He walked up to a legion of men clad in leather and steel, men the world called outlaws, and he made a plea. What happened next wasn't just an answer to a prayer. It was an earthquake of loyalty, a tidal wave of righteous fury that would wash over their lives and change everything. It's the story of how a $5 kindness was repaid with a fortress of protection, proving that the greatest heroes are often found in the places we are taught to fear the most. The air in the Starlight Diner was thick enough to be a meal in itself. It was a heavy broth of old grease, stale coffee, and the faint, sweet perfume of pine-scented cleaner, fighting a losing battle against decades of fried onions. For Clara Hale, who was just 19 but felt closer to 100, this air was the very atmosphere of her life. She breathed it in, and it coated her lungs, her clothes, her hair. Sometimes she thought if you cut her, she would bleed lukewarm coffee. She moved through the narrow aisle between the cracked vinyl booths and the wobbly counter stools with a practiced, weary grace. Her white apron, tied tightly around her slim waist, had a faint yellow stain near the pocket that no amount of bleach could conquer. It was her ghost, a pale reminder of a mustard bottle explosion from the previous summer. Her feet, encased in worn-out sneakers she'd bought at a thrift store, ached with a deep, rhythmic throb that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. In a booth in the far corner, tucked away from the sporadic gusts of cold air that accompanied every customer, sat her brother. Leo was 10. He was a small, serious boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's worried eyes. A thick textbook, far too large for him, was open on the table. He wasn't reading it. His gaze was fixed on his sister, tracking her every move. He watched her refill a trucker's coffee cup, her smile practiced and brief. He watched her balance 3 plates on one arm, a skill that seemed like a form of magic to him. He watched the weariness that clung to her like a second skin, a shadow that didn't leave even when she smiled at him. Their life was a fragile thing, a house of cards built on Clara's meager tips and the dwindling hope that their mother would get better. They lived in a constant state of quiet, managed panic. The numbers were always running in Clara's head, a cruel and relentless abacus clicking away with every order she took. Rent, utilities, the new prescription for their mom, the one the doctor said was not a suggestion, but a necessity. The cost of it was a figure so impossibly large, it felt like a mountain she was supposed to move with a teaspoon. Every crinkle of a dollar bill tucked under a plate was a tiny victory, every empty table a looming threat. Tonight was a slow night. The rain that had been threatening all the day had finally broken, and it fell in cold, relentless sheets against the diner's large plate glass windows. The streetlights outside bled into shimmering, distorted puddles of orange and white. The few customers hunched over their meals, isolated islands in the sea of empty red booths. Leo traced a pattern in the condensation on the window with his finger, his homework forgotten. He knew the numbers too, not the exact figures, but he understood their weight. He saw it in the way Clara would sometimes stand perfectly still in the kitchen of their tiny apartment, her eyes closed, just breathing for a full minute before she could continue. He saw it in the way she ate only one meal a day, claiming she was too tired to be hungry. He knew their life was a tightrope, and his sister was walking it for all of them. The bell above the diner door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that was entirely out of place in the gloom. It brought with it a blast of damp, cold air that made Leo shiver. A man stood there, framed in the doorway, seeming to block out what little light was left in the world. He was enormous, not just tall, but wide, a solid block of a man carved from granite and leather. A thick, dark beard, threaded with gray, covered the lower half of his face. His hair was pulled back in a tight, severe tail. A black leather vest, strained at the seams across his massive chest and shoulders, was adorned with a complex tapestry of patches. The largest one, on his back, depicted a snarling bear's head inside a cogwheel with the words Iron Saints MC embroidered in stark silver thread above it. Tattoos spilled from beneath his sleeves, intricate rivers of black and gray ink that disappeared into the cuffs of his worn leather gloves. He moved with a slow, deliberate weight, the floorboards groaning softly under his heavy boots. The few other customers in the diner fell silent. The trucker hunched lower over his coffee. A couple in a nearby booth suddenly found their placemats fascinating. The man's presence sucked the air out of the room, replacing it with something heavier, something ancient and vaguely dangerous. He didn't look around. He just walked to the counter and took a seat on one of the stools, his back to the room. It wasn't a defensive posture. It was a statement. The world was behind him. It could do as it pleased. Clara, who had frozen for a half second behind the counter, forced her feet to move. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Men like this were a rarity in the starlight. They usually stuck to the highway bars out past the county line. She grabbed a menu and a glass of water, her hand trembling, almost imperceptibly. "Welcome to the starlight," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too bright. She placed the water and menu on the counter in front of him. "Coffee?" The man didn't look at her. He stared at his own reflection in the dark surface of the counter. After a long moment, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Black." His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. Clara scurried away to get the coffee, her whole body humming with a nervous energy. She could feel Leo's eyes on her from the corner booth. He was watching the man with a mixture of fear and absolute fascination. To a 10-year-old boy, this man wasn't just a customer. He was a creature from a myth, a giant from a forgotten story. She returned with a thick, heavy mug and filled it, the dark liquid steaming in the cool air. The man wrapped a gloved hand around the mug, his fingers dwarfing it. He still didn't look at the menu. "Just a cheeseburger. Fries," he grunted, then took a long sip of the coffee. "Coming right up," Clara chirped, snatching the menu away and hurrying to the pass-through window to shout the order to the cook. For the next 20 minutes, an uneasy quiet settled over the diner. The only sounds were the hiss and sizzle from the kitchen, the clatter of cutlery, and the steady drumming of the rain. The big man didn't move except to lift his coffee mug to his lips. He sat like a statue, a monument to something the modern world had tried to pave over. Clara bustled about, trying to look busy, wiping down already clean counters, refilling salt shakers. She was acutely aware of him, of the sheer space he occupied, both physically and psychically. She was also aware of the $5 bill tucked into the front pocket of her jeans. It was her gas money for the next 3 days. More than that, it was the last of her cash until her paycheck on Friday, which was already entirely spoken for. That $5 was a tiny, flimsy shield against the howling void of their finances. Sal slapped the plate on the pass-through, and Clara carried it over to the man. The burger was huge, piled high with cheese and lettuce, a mountain of golden fries next to it. She set it down in front of him. "Anything else for you?" she asked. For the first time, he turned his head slightly and looked at her. His eyes were a pale, startling blue, set deep within a weathered face. They weren't cruel eyes, she noted with some surprise. They were just old. They looked tired, as if they had seen too much of the road, too much of the world. "This is good," he said, his voice a low gravel. Then he turned back to his plate and began to eat. Clara retreated, her heart rate slowly returning to normal. He was just a man, a very large, very intimidating man, but just a man having a burger. She stole a glance at Leo. He was watching the biker eat, mesmerized by the efficient, no-nonsense way he dispatched the meal. When he was finished, not a single fry left on the plate, the man pushed it away and finished his coffee. He sat for another minute, staring into the empty mug. Then with a soft grunt, he stood up. He reached into the back pocket of his jeans, pulling out a worn leather wallet that looked like it had been through a war. He flipped it open and froze. Clara watched him from her post by the coffee machine. She saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his massive shoulders tensed. He patted his other pockets, his movements becoming more urgent. A low curse, barely audible, escaped his lips. He opened the wallet again, staring into it as if hoping cash would magically materialize. It was empty. He pulled out a credit card and stared at it, a look of profound frustration crossing his face. He looked up and caught her eye in the mirror behind the counter. The expression on his face was not one of anger or entitlement. It was one of quiet, weary humiliation. In that split second, the intimidating facade of leather and ink and muscle dissolved, and Clara saw something else. She saw a man who was tired, far from home, and caught in a moment of simple, frustrating vulnerability. It was a look she knew well. She saw it in her own reflection every morning. He walked over to the cash register where she stood. "There's a problem," he rumbled, holding up the credit card. "My bank. They lock the card when I cross state lines sometimes, if I forget to call." "Stupid. I don't have any cash on me." He wasn't making an excuse or trying to get out of the bill. He was just stating a fact. The bill was $9.50. Clara's mind raced. She could call the manager, who would probably call the police. That would create a scene, paperwork, and a world of trouble for this man, all over less than $10. It felt wrong. It felt cruel. She looked from the man's tired, frustrated face to the $5 bill she could feel pressed against her leg in her pocket. It was a stupid, reckless thought. That $5 was her lifeline. It was 3 days of security, however thin. Giving it away was not just an act of charity, it was an act of self-sabotage. Her mother's medicine loomed in her mind, the rent. But then she looked at the man again, at the deep lines etched around his eyes. She saw the ghost of 100 lonely highways in his gaze. She saw a flicker of the same desperation she felt every single day. And in that moment, he wasn't a scary biker. He was just a person in a jam. Before she could second-guess herself, before the relentless abacus in her head could scream at her, she acted. "Don't worry about it," she said, her voice soft. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out her crumpled $5 bill. She added it to the 4 singles and change in the register from her last customer and rang it up as paid. "It's on me." The man stared at her, his pale blue eyes wide with surprise. He looked down at the $5 bill she had taken from her own pocket, then back at her. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice losing some of its gravelly edge. "It's just a burger," Clara said, trying for a smile. "People have to eat. Maybe you can pay it forward sometime." He continued to stare at her for a long moment, a complicated expression on his face. It was a look of gratitude, but also of something deeper, a kind of quiet assessment. He seemed to be seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. Not just a waitress in a cheap uniform, but a person. "I'm Grizz," he said, his voice low. He gestured with his chin towards the patch on his vest. "This is my club. We have a code. We pay our debts." "There's no debt," Claire insisted, feeling a blush creep up her neck. "Just have a safe ride." Grizz nodded slowly. He reached for a napkin from the dispenser on the counter, pulled a pen from his vest pocket, and scribbled something on it. He slid it across the counter to her. It was a phone number and the name of a business, Iron Saints Garage. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice a solemn vow, "anything at all, you call this number. You ask for Grizz. I will answer." He held her gaze for another second, his eyes conveying a seriousness that went far beyond a $9 meal. Then he turned and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming his departure. The cold, wet air swirled in, and then he was gone, swallowed by the rain and the night. Clara stared at the napkin in her hand. It felt heavy, significant. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her legs felt weak. She had just given away her last $5. It was the stupidest, most irresponsible thing she had ever done. She looked over at her brother. Leo was staring at the door, his eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't quite read. It was awe. He had just witnessed an exchange that felt more important than the money involved. He had seen his sister, tired and poor, perform an act of grace. And he had seen the giant, the mythic creature, respond not with a threat, but with a promise. Clara crumpled the napkin and shoved it into her apron pocket, dismissing it. It was a nice gesture, but meaningless. What could a man like that possibly do for her? She had real problems, problems that couldn't be solved by a phone call to a motorcycle garage. She was wrong. She was so profoundly, life-alteringly wrong. And in the corner booth, her little brother Leo, committed the entire scene to memory. The man's face, his voice, the name of his garage, and the solemn weight of his promise. He tucked it away, a secret key for a lock he didn't yet know existed. The days that followed the biker's visit were a slow, grinding descent. The rain that had fallen that night seemed to seep into the walls of their lives, bringing with it a damp, persistent chill of despair. The brief, strange warmth of Clara's act of kindness faded, replaced by the cold, hard reality of her empty pockets. Their apartment, on the third floor of a crumbling brick building that smelled of dust and boiled cabbage, became a fortress under siege. It had never been a palace. The paint was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing layers of sickly green and yellow from decades past. A persistent draft whispered through the ill-fitting window frames, forcing Clara to stuff them with old rags. The faucet in the kitchen sink maintained a constant, maddening drip, a tiny metronome counting down their dwindling time. But it was their home. It was the only home Leo had ever known. It was where their father's faded photograph sat on the mantelpiece, a smiling ghost from a better time. It was where their mother now lay, a fragile bird in a nest of worn blankets. Her illness had been a slow thief, stealing her energy, her laughter, her presence. Now it was becoming a mugger. The new medication the doctor had prescribed was their only hope of stopping its aggressive advance. The cost was astronomical, a cruel joke. Clara had called the insurance company, a soul-crushing exercise in navigating automated menus and speaking to cheerful, unhelpful voices who used words like non-formulary and high deductible. The answer was always the same: no. So Clara worked. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, staying until 2 in the morning and coming back at 6 to open. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. She moved through her days in a haze of exhaustion, her body fueled by caffeine and sheer force of will. The ache in her feet was now a fire that shot up her legs. Her smiles for the customers became brittle, threatening to crack. And then the notice appeared. It was taped to their door, an aggressive slash of bright orange paper against the peeling brown paint. The words were cold, legal, and absolute. The building had been sold. The new owner was a corporation with a sterile, meaningless name: Apex Property Holdings. Effective in 30 days, their month-to-month lease was terminated. They were being evicted. Clara read the notice 3 times, the formal, unfeeling words blurring before her eyes. 30 days. It felt like 30 seconds. Where would they go? How could they possibly find a new place, come up with security deposit and first month's rent, when they couldn't even afford medicine? The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her. The quiet, managed panic she lived with erupted into a full-blown, silent scream in her mind. That night, the apathetic building became an actively hostile environment. The new ownership was not content to wait. The heat, which had always been unreliable, was shut off completely. The nights were growing colder, and the draft from the windows now felt like an icy breath on their necks. Clara piled every blanket they owned onto her mother's bed. She and Leo slept in their coats. A few days later, the hot water went. Clara had to boil pots of water on the stove just to wash their faces, to make her mother a warm compress for her aching joints. The simple act of living became a series of exhausting, complicated chores. The man behind it all was a name on the notice: Silas Croft, property manager for Apex. He was a local real estate developer known for buying up old properties, forcing out the low-income tenants through harassment and neglect, and then flipping the buildings for a massive profit. He was a predator, and they were his prey. Clara tried to fight. She called the number on the notice. A bored-sounding secretary transferred her to Croft's voicemail. She left a message, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. He never called back. She called the city's tenant rights hotline, only to be told that their resources were overwhelmed and it could be weeks before an advocate could even look at her case. Weeks they didn't have. Despair began to set in, a thick, suffocating fog. Clara felt like she was drowning. She would come home from the diner, the smell of grease still clinging to her, and find her mother weaker, her brother quieter. The weight of it all was crushing her. One evening she sat at their small kitchen table, the eviction notice and a stack of unpaid bills spread out before her like a tarot reading of their doom. She put her head in her hands, and for the first time in a long time, she began to cry. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent, hot tears of utter defeat that slid between her fingers and splattered onto the cruel black and white numbers on the page. Leo stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching her. His sister, who was always in motion, always fighting, was finally still, and she was broken. The sight of her defeated form did something to him. The fear he had been living with for weeks solidified into something hard and sharp. Resolve. He remembered the diner. He remembered the giant of a man. He remembered the look on his face when Clara had shown him kindness. He remembered the promise. If you ever need anything, you call this number. Clara had thrown the napkin away, but Leo had not forgotten. He had a photographic memory for things that mattered. Iron Saint's Garage. He didn't have the number, but he had the name. And in a town this size, a name like that was as good as an address. He went to his room, his heart pounding a new determined rhythm. He put on his worn jacket and his sturdiest shoes. He scribbled a quick, messy note for Clara. Went to the library, be back soon, and left it on his bed. It was a lie, but a necessary one. He couldn't let her stop him. He slipped out of the apartment, his small body a shadow in the dim, unheated hallway. He crept down the 3 flights of stairs, his sneakers making no sound, and pushed open the heavy front door. The world that greeted him was cold and gray. The sun was setting, painting the undersides of the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. A biting wind swept down the street, carrying with it the smell of impending snow and the distant rumble of traffic. Leo knew where he had to go. The west end of town, the industrial district. It was a part of town his mother had always told him to avoid, a place of abandoned warehouses, scrap yards, and grim-looking businesses with bars on the windows. It was a long walk, miles from their apartment, but he didn't hesitate. He set off, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his chin tucked into his collar. He walked with a purpose that made him seem older than his 10 years. He navigated the familiar streets of his neighborhood, then crossed the boulevard into unfamiliar territory. The houses grew smaller, then gave way to auto body shops and plumbing supply stores. The sidewalks became cracked and broken, littered with debris. The sky darkened. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like ghosts. He was the only person on foot. Cars sped past, their occupants sealed away in warm bubbles of light and music, oblivious to the small boy on his desperate pilgrimage. He was scared. Every dark alleyway seemed to hold a lurking monster. Every sudden noise made him jump. But the image of his sister crying at the kitchen table was a fire in his chest, burning away the fear. She had fought for them until she couldn't fight anymore. Now it was his turn. Finally he saw it, a low, sprawling brick building set back from the road, surrounded by a chain-link fence. A faded sign hung over a large bay door, the words Iron Saint's Garage, painted in black, uncompromising letters. A dozen motorcycles, chrome and steel beasts, were parked in a neat, formidable line out front. They looked like sleeping dragons. This was it, the giant's lair. Leo's breath hitched. His courage, which had carried him all this way, suddenly faltered. The building was intimidating, radiating a palpable aura of keep out. The windows were dark. It looked closed, deserted, but he could see a faint line of light glowing from beneath a smaller, steel-reinforced door to the side of the main garage. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He walked through the open gate, his small feet crunching on the gravel driveway. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet. He walked past the line of motorcycles, feeling like an ant marching past a row of elephants. He reached the steel door. There was no bell, no handle, just a heavy black plate of metal. He hesitated for a moment, his small, gloveless hand hovering in the air. Then, thinking of his mother's pale face and Clara's tears, he balled his hand into a fist and knocked. The sound was small and pathetic against the thick steel. He knocked again, harder this time, the impact jarring his knuckles. For a long moment, there was nothing. He was about to turn away, his mission a failure, when he heard a heavy clank from within, a series of bolts being drawn back. The sound was loud, final, like the opening of a vault. The door swung inward with a low groan. A wall of warm, smoky air, thick with the scent of motor oil, stale beer, and leather, washed over him. He was met with a silhouette, a man even bigger than the one from the diner, blocking the light from within. "What do you want, kid?" The man's voice was a deep growl. Leo had to crane his neck to look up at him. The man's face was a roadmap of scars, a long since healed cut bisecting one eyebrow. I, I need to see Grizz, Leo stammered, his own voice sounding thin and reedy. The man squinted down at him, his expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Grizz is busy. Who's asking?" "My name is Leo," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. He told He told my sister to find him if she ever needed anything. We need him. We need him now. The big man stared at him for another long second, then grunted. "Wait here." He turned and disappeared back into the clubhouse, leaving the door slightly ajar. Leo stood on the doorstep, shivering, caught between the cold night behind him and the intimidating warmth within. He could hear the low murmur of voices from inside, the clink of glass, and the mellow strains of an old rock song. After what felt like an eternity, he heard heavy footsteps approaching. Grizz appeared in the doorway. He was just as Leo remembered, a mountain of a man. He looked down at Leo, his pale blue eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. "You're the kid from the diner," he rumbled, "the waitress's brother." Leo nodded, unable to speak. Grizz's eyes swept over him, taking in his thin jacket, his red raw hands, the determined but terrified look on his face. He saw a boy who had walked a long way in the cold. His expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Come on in, son," he said, stepping back and holding the door open wider. "Get out of the cold." Leo hesitated for only a second before stepping over the threshold, out of the darkness and into the lion's den. The inside of the Iron Saints clubhouse was cavernous and dimly lit. The air was thick with the smells Leo had first encountered at the door, a masculine potpourri of oil, leather, and smoke. The walls were exposed brick, adorned with framed photos, old road signs, and banners bearing the club's snarling bear insignia. A long, scarred wooden bar ran along one wall, and a dozen men, all large, all bearded, most clad in leather vests, were scattered around, sitting at the bar or at heavy wooden tables. When Leo walked in, every conversation stopped. Every head turned. A dozen pairs of hard, curious eyes fixed on the small boy standing just inside the door, dwarfed by Grizz's massive frame. The silence was absolute, heavy, and deeply unnerving. It felt like walking into a cage of sleeping predators and accidentally kicking the bars. Leo's courage evaporated. His legs felt like they were made of water. He wanted to turn and run, to flee back into the cold anonymous night. But then Grizz placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a gargantuan hand, warm and heavy, and the simple, steady pressure was surprisingly grounding. It wasn't threatening, it was reassuring. "He's with me," Grizz announced to the room, his voice a low command that broke the spell. The men turned back to their drinks, the murmur of conversation slowly resuming. But Leo could still feel their eyes on him, watching him from the corners of the room. Grizz led him past the tables towards a quieter area at the back of the clubhouse, where a few worn leather armchairs were gathered around a pot-bellied stove that glowed with a comforting orange heat. "Sit down, son," Grizz said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Leo sank into the deep leather, which seemed to swallow him whole. Grizz pulled up another chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't loom over Leo. He sat so they were at eye level, a simple act of respect that did more to calm the boy's racing heart than any words could have. "Now," Grizz began, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You walked a long way to find me. You look scared, but you're here. That tells me this is important. So you start at the beginning, and you tell me everything." Leo looked into the man's pale, serious eyes. He took a shaky breath, the image of his crying sister flashing in his mind. The words came tumbling out, a torrent of fear and desperation held back for too long. "It's my sister, Clara," he began, his voice trembling but clear. "The waitress, you remember. She gave you the money for your burger. It was her last $5. She didn't have any more." Grizz's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He remembered. He remembered the girl's tired eyes and the simple, unhesitating kindness. He had known even then that the act had cost her something. "And our mom," Leo continued, his voice cracking. She's sick, really sick. The doctors gave her new medicine, but it costs too much money, and the insurance won't pay, and Claire's been working all the time, but it's not enough. He paused to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand, angry at the tears. And now they're kicking us out. This man, he bought our building. He turned off the heat and the water. He put a notice on our door. It says we have to be out in 22 days. We have nowhere to go. I knew. Clara, I came home tonight and she was crying. She never cries. He finally looked up at Grizz, his young face a mask of desperate, pleading earnestness. She tried to call him, but he won't answer. She doesn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. But I remembered you. You told her to call if she needed anything. She threw the napkin away, but I remembered. You said you were a fine of your word. You said you pay your debts. He finished his speech, his chest heaving, all his energy spent. He had laid the entire unbearable weight of his family's world at this stranger's feet. He watched the big man's face, searching for any sign of hope, any flicker of empathy. Grizz was silent for a long time. He stared at the bomb, his gaze intense. The story settled around them, a pall of injustice in the warm, smoky air. The casual cruelty of it all, the predatory landlord, the faceless insurance company, the soul-crushing poverty. It was a story as old as time, and it filled him with a cold, familiar rage. This was the kind of rot he and his club stood against, the kind of bully that preyed on the weak and the unprotected. This man who bought your building, Grizz said, his voice dangerously quiet. What's his name? Croft, Leo said immediately. Silas Croft, Apex Property Holdings. Grizz nodded slowly, filing the name away. Then he asked another question, this one seemingly unrelated. What's your last name, son? Hale, Leo answered. Leo Hale. The name hung in the air between them. Hale, a flicker of something, a distant memory, stirred in the back of Grizz's mind. He had known a Hale once, a long time ago. And your father? Grizz asked, his voice even softer now. What was his name? Michael, Leo said, his voice dropping. Michael Hale. He died when I was little. He was a mechanic. Michael Hale, the mechanic. It all came crashing back to Grizz in a sudden, vivid rush. The name, the profession, the memory of a young, eager face, full of grit and promise. A prospect, a kid who had wanted to be an iron saint more than anything. A kid who had shown up every day, worked on the bikes, done the dirty jobs, never complained, always smiling. Mike Wrench Hale. He'd been killed in a freak accident at the auto shop where he worked, a car slipping off a faulty lift. The club had gone to his funeral, a somber line of black leather in the back of the church. They'd lost touch with his young wife and kid afterward. Life, in the road, had moved on. Grizz felt a cold dread wash over him. They had let him slip through the cracks. They had let his family, his legacy, fall into this state of desperation. They had broken their own code without even knowing it. The club was supposed to look after its own, even the ghosts of its own. The boy, Leo Hale, was not just the brother of a kind waitress. He was the son of a fallen brother. This was not a stranger's problem. This was a family matter, a profound, sacred debt that had gone unpaid for years. Grizz's entire demeanor shifted. The quiet contemplation in his eyes hardened into something else entirely. It was a look of grim, absolute, chilling resolve. The patriarch bear had been awakened, and he had found one of his cubs, lost and wounded. He reached into the deep inner pocket of his vest and pulled out his wallet, the same worn wallet from the diner. He bypassed the empty cash fold and went to a hidden flap at the back. From it, he carefully extracted a faded, creased photograph. He stared at it for a moment, his thumb gently brushing over the surface, before he handed it to Leo. It was a picture of 5 men, all younger, leaner, standing proudly in front of a row of motorcycles. In the center was a younger Grizz, his beard darker, his face less lined. And there, on the far right, with his arms slung over another biker's shoulder, was a smiling young man with dark hair and familiar kind eyes. It was unmistakably Leo's father. Your dad, Grizz said, his voice thick with emotion. Michael, he was one of us. He was a prospect for this chapter. He was family. Leo stared at the photograph, his eyes wide. He had so few pictures of his father. To see him like this, young and happy and part of this tribe of giants, was overwhelming. It was like finding a missing piece of his own history. Grizz leaned forward and knelt down on the floor in front of Leo's chair, the old leather of his pants groaning in protest. He put his massive hands on the boy's small, bony shoulders, forcing Leo to look him in the eye. The gesture was one of profound solemnity. "Listen to me, Leo Hale," Grizz said, his voice a low, powerful rumble that vibrated through the boy's entire body. "Your fear ends tonight. Right here. Right now. You don't have to be scared anymore. I promise you. On the memory of your father, a brother of this club, I promise you. We will handle this. Every last bit of it. The man who is trying to hurt you, the sickness that is hurting your mother, the walls that are crumbling around you. It all ends. Your family is our family now, and we protect our own." The words were a vow, an oath sworn in the heart of his fortress, witnessed by the ghost of a fallen friend. For the first time in weeks, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in Leo's heart. As if on cue, a woman with a long graying braid and a leather vest that had Mama Bear stitched over the pocket approached them. She had been watching from the bar. She had a steaming mug in her hands. "Here, kid," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Hot chocolate. Extra marshmallows." She handed the mug to Leo, whose cold hands wrapped around it, soaking in the warmth. Another biker appeared, a silent giant with a shaved head, and draped a thick wool blanket over Leo's shoulders. It smelled faintly of wood smoke. Leo looked from the warm mug to the heavy blanket to the unwavering, fierce loyalty in Grizz's eyes. The tension that had held him together for weeks, the rigid posture of a child trying to be a man, finally broke. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He wasn't crying from sadness or fear anymore. He was crying from relief. He was safe. He had found the thunder and it was on his side. Grizz stood up, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. This was not a rage directed at the boy, but at the world that had necessitated his terrifying journey. He turned away from Leo, who was now being tended to by Mama Bear, and faced the rest of his club. The room had fallen silent again. Every man was watching him, waiting. They had heard the boy's story. They had seen the photograph. They understood. Grizz didn't need to shout. He didn't need to make a speech. He just looked at his sergeant-at-arms, a lean, wiry man with cold eyes known only as Reaper. "Hale's kids," Grizz said, the two words landing with the force of a gavel. It was all that was needed, an ironclad directive, a call to arms. Reaper nodded once, a short, sharp jerk of his head. He pulled out his phone. "Rally, everyone," Grizz commanded, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "Full chapter. Every member, now. Tell them it's a code 1. Tell them it's for wrench." Reaper's thumb was already flying across the screen, sending out the summons. A code 1 was the club's highest state of alert, reserved for dire emergencies, for threats against the club's family. It was a call that was never, ever ignored. Grizz then turned to another member, a man with glasses and a thoughtful expression who looked more like a professor than a biker. His patch read Counsel. "I want everything you can find on a real estate developer named Silas Croft and his company, Apex Property Holdings. Financials, properties, pending lawsuits, building code violations, everything. I want it an hour ago." Counsel nodded, already pulling a laptop from a worn saddlebag. Next, Grizz pointed to a grizzled, older biker with a calm demeanor. His patch simply said, "Doc. Doc, you're with me. We're going to see the boy's mother. Find out what she needs. Medicine, specialists, whatever it is. The club's treasury is open." The clubhouse, which had been a place of lazy camaraderie moments before, was now a hive of silent, focused activity. Men were finishing their drinks, shrugging on jackets, their faces grim and set. The air crackled with purpose. The sleeping giants were awake. And then the sound began. It started as a low, distant hum. A vibration felt more than heard. It was the sound of a single engine, then 2, then 10. It grew steadily, a deep baritone rumble that vibrated in the concrete floor of the garage. It was the sound of the Iron Saints answering the call. Leo, wrapped in his blanket and sipping his hot chocolate, heard it. He went to the now open bay door and looked out into the night. What he saw made his jaw drop. From every direction, headlights were converging on the industrial park. They poured in from the main road, a river of brilliant white light cutting through the darkness. They snaked down the side streets, a relentless, glittering tide. The rumble grew into a ground-shaking thunder, the distinctive, staggered roar of dozens, then scores of V-twin engines. It was a sound that shook the soul, a symphony of raw, untamed power. They pulled into the gravel lot one by one, and in small groups, parking in neat, disciplined rows beside the first wave of bikes. Men of all ages and descriptions swung their legs over their machines. There were mechanics and carpenters, electricians and plumbers, a high school history teacher, a bar owner, even a quiet IT specialist who moonlighted as the club's tech guru. They were a cross-section of the town's blue-collar heart, united by the patch on their backs. They were over 100 strong, a sea of black leather and denim and steel that filled the entire lot. They didn't speak. They just dismounted and stood by their bikes, their faces illuminated by the idling headlights, waiting. I seen an army, summoned from the night by a single call, awaiting their orders. Grizz walked out into the center of the lot, the gravel crunching under his boots. He stood before his men, a patriarch surveying his clan. The idling engines provided a rumbling, respectful silence. He laid out the mission with the brutal efficiency of a field general. Tonight, he began, his voice cutting through the engine noise, we are settling a debt to a fallen brother, Michael Wrench Hale. A murmur went through the older members who remembered the name. His family, his 19-year-old daughter and his 10-year-old son, are in trouble. They are being terrorized by a predatory landlord. Their mother is sick and can't get the medicine she needs. Our world has failed them. We failed them by not knowing. That failure ends now. He pointed a gloved finger towards the city lights. Here's the plan. It will be executed with discipline. We are not a mob. We are the Iron Saints. We are a surgical instrument. Team Alpha, he barked, pointing to Reaper. You take 30 men. You will go to the family's apartment building. You will establish a perimeter. You are not to announce. Bonlas, you may not engage, threaten, or speak to anyone unless spoken to. You are a silent, visible presence. You are a wall. You will ensure that no one from the landlord's company comes near that family. You will remain until I tell you to stand down. Reaper nodded, already gesturing to a group of the largest, most stoic members. Team Bravo, Grizz continued, his voice dropping. That's with me. We will consist of 12 men. We are going to pay a visit to Mr. Silas Croft. We are going to have a conversation. A quiet, respectful conversation about his business practices. A few of the men smiled grimly. They knew what a quiet conversation with Grizz entailed. Team Charlie, he said, looking at Doc. You, Patches, and Hammer are coming with me to the family's apartment first. We will assess the mother's condition and get her immediate care. Patches, he said to a biker known for his resourcefulness, you have the club card. The limit is removed. You will acquire whatever medicine Doc says is needed tonight. No excuses. Counsel, Grizz called out to the lawyer, who was now standing by the door with his laptop open. You are our eye in the scabish. You will feed us legal intelligence. You will be on the phone with me when I speak to Croft. You will be our sword and our shield. He scanned the faces of his men, their expressions hard and ready in the stark glare of the headlights. There will be no unsanctioned violence. There will be no chaos. We will be disciplined. We will be relentless. We are the wrath they have earned, but we are also the justice this family deserves. Wrench's family is our family. Is that understood? A single, unified roar of hoorah erupted from 100 throats, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings around them. Let's ride, Grizz commanded. The engines roared to life in unison, a deafening, magnificent thunder. The river of headlights turned as one, and the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club poured out of the industrial park and into the sleeping city, a silent, disciplined army of leather-clad angels on a mission of righteous fury. Leo watched them go, his small hand clutching the warm mug, the roar of the engines a promise of the storm that was about to break. The first stop was the apartment building. The procession of motorcycles, now moving with an eerie, coordinated quiet, flowed into the residential street. It was a startling, surreal sight, a river of chrome and steel flooding a street of tired brick and sleeping windows. Grizz, Doc, and two other members dismounted, while Reaper's Team Alpha fanned out around the building. They moved with a chilling, practiced silence. They didn't rev their engines or shout. They simply took up positions. 2 men at the front entrance, 2 at the back alley, others stood at the corners of the block, or simply sat on their bikes, their engines off, becoming silent, leather-clad gargoyles under the streetlights. They were a human fence, a wall of quiet intimidation. Any tenant who happened to look out their window would see their building was now under the silent, watchful protection of an army. Grizz led his small team up the 3 flights of stairs. He knocked on the door to the Hale apartment, a gentle tap that was a world away from the power he commanded. The door opened a crack. Clara's face appeared, pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear and confusion at the sight of the men filling her hallway. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a frightened whisper. Then she saw Grizz, recognition, and a new wave of fear washed over her. The biker from the diner. What was he doing here? Had he come back for his $9.50? "Clara Hale?" Grizz asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, clutching the door. "Your brother Leo, he came to find me," Grizz explained softly. "He told me about your situation. May we come in? This is Doc. He's here to help your mother." Clara's mind reeled. Leo? Where was Leo? How did he find this man? Her fear was warring with a desperate, burgeoning hope. She looked at Doc, who had a kind, calm face despite the fearsome leather vest. She looked at Grizz's eyes, which held no threat, only a deep, solemn concern. She opened the door. The apartment was colder inside than it was in the hallway. The air was stale and still. Grizz's heart ached at the sight of it. The peeling paint, the threadbare furniture. This was how his brother's family had been living. Doc went immediately to the small bedroom where their mother lay. Clara followed, wringing her hands. Grizz stayed in the main room, his massive frame seeming to take up all the space. He saw the eviction notice on the table, a splash of orange venom. He picked it up, his jaw tightening as he read the cold, bureaucratic language. A few minutes later, Doc emerged from the bedroom, his expression grim. "She's suffering from severe pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition and dehydration," he said quietly to Grizz. "The prescription she has is the right one, but she hasn't been able to take it consistently. She needs it now, and she needs warmth and proper food." Grizz nodded. He pulled out his phone and dialed Patches, who had been waiting downstairs. "You have the name of the medicine?" he asked Doc. Doc rattled off a long, complicated name. Grizz repeated it into the phone. "Find a 24-hour pharmacy. I don't care how far you have to drive. Get a full month's supply. And on your way back, stop at an all-night grocery store. I want broth, bread, fruit, everything. Go." He hung up and turned to Clara, who had overheard everything, her face a mask of disbelief. "He'll be back within the hour," Grizz said simply. "Doc will stay with your mother until then." I can't pay for this," Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I have nothing." Grizz took a step closer. He pulled the faded photograph from his pocket and showed it to her. "This is your father, Michael," he said, his voice soft. "He was our brother. We don't take money from family." Clara stared at the picture, her hand flying to her mouth. A sob escaped her. It was a picture she had never seen, a vision of her father from a life she never knew he had. The bikers, the leather, the intimidating presence, it all suddenly clicked into place. These weren't monsters. They were her father's people. They were her people. The tears that now flowed were not of fear, but of an overwhelming, heart-wrenching relief. Grizz let her have her moment. Then his expression hardened again as he looked at the eviction notice in his hand. "I have to go now," he said. "I have a conversation to have with Mr. Silas Croft. Don't you worry about him. By the time the sun comes up, he will no longer be your problem." He turned and left, leaving Doc to care for her mother in a profound sense of bewildered hope in his wake. The next stop was a world away from the crumbling poverty of Clara's neighborhood. Silas Croft lived in a sprawling, ostentatious mansion in a gated community called Eagle's Crest. The houses were enormous, the lawns were perfectly manicured, and the silence was heavy and sterile. Grizz and his 12-man negotiation team rolled up to the security gate. The guard, a young man in a crisp uniform, took one look at the phalanx of motorcycles and his eyes went wide. Grizz dismounted and walked to the guard booth. "We're here to see Silas Croft," he said, his voice calm. "Do you have an appointment?" the guard stammered. "He's expecting us," Grizz lied smoothly. "Tell him Grizz from the Iron Saints is here to discuss one of his properties." The guard, clearly terrified, made the call. A moment later, the gate slowly swung open. The 12 motorcycles rumbled through the pristine streets of Eagle's Crest, a visceral, anarchic presence in a world of beige stucco and hollow status symbols. They pulled up in front of Croft's house, a monstrosity of faux Tuscan architecture, and parked in a perfect, intimidating line along the curb. Silas Croft was waiting for them on his doorstep, illuminated by his porch lights. He was a man in his 50s, with slicked back hair, a soft, fleshy face, and a $1,000 suit he wore even at home. He had a look of arrogant amusement on his face, as if this was all some kind of amusing diversion. "Well, well," Croft said with a condescending smirk as Grizz and his men walked up his perfectly laid brick path. "To what do I owe the pleasure of a visit from the local chapter of, what is it, the Hells Angels?" "Iron Saints," Grizz corrected him, his voice flat and cold. He stopped a few feet from Croft, his men fanning out behind him in a silent, menacing semicircle. They just stood there, arms crossed, their faces unreadable. Their sheer, silent presence was more terrifying than any threat. "We're here to talk about the building on Elm Street," Grizz said. "The one you just bought." Croft let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Ah, yes, the tenement. I assume one of your associates is a resident? Look, I'm sorry, but it's just business. I'm tearing it down to build luxury condos. The eviction notices are perfectly legal." "We're not here to debate the legality," Grizz said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "We're here to talk about the family in apartment 3B, the Hales." "The Hales?" Croft scoffed. "The waitress and her sick mother? They're months behind on rent. What about them?" "You turned off their heat and hot water in the middle of autumn," Grizz stated, not as a question, but as an indictment. "That is not legal." "Prove it," Croft sneered. "Faulty boiler. It's an old building. These things happen." Grizz took a slow step forward. Croft's smirk faltered slightly. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Croft," Grizz said, his voice at a low, chilling whisper. "You are going to turn the heat and hot water back on. Tonight, you are going to rescind the eviction notice for the Hale family. You are going to forgive all their back rent and make all necessary repairs to their apartment at your expense, and you're going to do it now." Croft stared at him, then burst out laughing. It was a loud, braying, arrogant sound. "You're insane. You and your band of thugs think you can come to my house and intimidate me? I'll have the police here in 30 seconds. "Go ahead," Grizz said calmly. "Call them. We'll wait." He then pulled out his own phone and hit a number on his speed dial. He put it on a speaker. "Counsel, are you there?" Grizz asked. "I'm here, Grizz," the lawyer's calm, professional voice replied from the phone. "Good evening, Mr. Croft. My name is Arthur Jennings. I'm legal counsel for the Iron Saints MC, and as of 20 minutes ago, I am the pro bono representative for the Hale family." Croft's laughter died in his throat. "Mr. Croft," counsel's voice continued, crisp and relentless, "I've just done a preliminary search on your company, Apex Property Holdings. I've found 17 pending complaints with the City Housing Authority for illegal eviction practices across 3 of your properties. I've also cross-referenced your maintenance records with city codes. The faulty boiler in the Elm Street property has been the subject of 3 separate tenant complaints in the last year, all of which you ignored. Shutting it off now constitutes a clear case of tenant harassment and constructive eviction, which carries a rather hefty fine and potential suspension of your real estate license." Croft's face had gone pale. His arrogance was evaporating, replaced by a sheen of cold sweat. "Furthermore," counsel continued, his voice like ice, "I'm currently drafting a civil suit on behalf of the Hale family for damages related to emotional distress and the exacerbation of a pre-existing medical condition, due to deliberate neglect of your duties as a landlord. Given your documented history, I'm confident we can also convince a judge to open a broader investigation into your business practices. RICO statutes can be a very creative legal tool in cases of systematic fraud and intimidation. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves in Croft's perfectly landscaped trees. The sneer was gone from his face, replaced by a look of dawning horror. He wasn't dealing with a gang of dumb thugs. He was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a disciplined, well-oiled machine. Grizz took another step forward, his shadow falling over the smaller man. He leaned in close, his voice a barely audible, venomous whisper. "Now, you can deal with him," Grizz murmured, nodding at the phone, "or you can deal with us, and we are much, much more patient." "See, Mr. Croft," he continued, his voice a low, terrifying purr. "The law is slow, but we're not. We are the Iron Saints. Michael Hale was our brother. His family is our family. If you choose not to be reasonable, we will simply become a part of your life, 100 of us. We will be here on this street every day. We won't break any laws. We'll just be here. When you go to work, when you come home, when you go out to dinner, we'll be there watching. We will picket your office. We will attend every one of your zoning meetings. We will talk to every one of your investors and business partners. We will become your own personal leather-clad conscience. We will be the ghosts at every feast. We will be here, always, until you do the right thing, or until your entire, carefully constructed world has turned to dust around you." He straightened up. "So you have two options: a long, expensive, and very public legal battle that will ruin you, or you can sign the papers that my associate is emailing to your phone right now. Your choice." Croft's hands were shaking as he pulled out his own phone. A new email had just arrived. The subject line read, "Hale Settlement and Property Transfer." He opened it. It was a legally binding agreement drafted by counsel in the last hour, detailing all of Grizz's demands. Rescind the eviction, forgive the debt, pay for all repairs. And there was one more clause. It was an offer to sell the entire Elm Street building at a significant loss to a newly formed holding company named St. Michael's Properties, LLC. A company counsel had registered less than an hour ago, funded by the Iron Saints Treasury. Croft stared at the phone, then at the 12 silent, implacable figures standing on his lawn, then at Grizz's cold, unwavering eyes. He saw his future, a future of endless legal fees, public humiliation, and the constant, unnerving presence of this biker army. He saw his reputation, his business, his comfortable life all crumbling. He was beaten, utterly and completely. "I'll sign," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'll sign it all." Grizz nodded once. A wise decision. He turned to his men. "Let's go. We're done here." Without another word, they turned and walked back to their bikes, their heavy boots silent on the perfect brick path. They mounted up and rumbled away, leaving Silas Croft standing alone on his brightly lit porch in the ruins of his arrogant world. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon with pale fingers of gray and pink when Grizz returned to the apartment building. The members of Team Alpha were still there, silent sentinels at their posts. Patches's bike was now parked out front, the empty grocery bags and pharmacy receipt testament to his successful mission. Grizz walked back up the stairs. The air in the hallway was warm. The maddening drip from the kitchen sink had stopped. He pushed open the door to the apartment. The transformation was stunning. The room was warm, filled with the smell of chicken broth and fresh bread. Clara was in the kitchen, humming softly as she sliced an apple. She looked up when Grizz entered, and her face broke into a radiant, tearful smile. It was the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. "The heat is on," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "The hot water, too. A man from the management company came an hour ago. He fixed the faucet. He was terrified." "He had reason to be," Grizz said simply. He walked over to the table and tore the orange eviction notice in half, then in half again, and dropped the pieces into the trash. "It's over. He won't bother you again. In fact," he added, "as of about an hour ago, you have a new landlord." He explained how the club had bought the building, how it was now held in a trust named for her father. Your rent is now $1 a year, he finished, and any repairs will be handled by our members. This home is yours for as long as you want it. Clara stared at him, speechless. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. It wasn't just a rescue, it was a resurrection. They had not just saved her from drowning, they had given her a new ship and a map to a safe harbor. Why? She finally whispered, the question that had been burning in her mind. Why would you do all of this? For a $9 burger? For a man you knew years ago? Grizz sat down at the small kitchen table, which suddenly seemed sturdier. The burger got my attention, he admitted. Your kindness in the face of your own struggle. It reminded me of what's good in the world. But this, he said, gesturing around the warm apartment, this is not about that. Your father, he said, his voice low and full of reverence, swore an oath when he decided to prospect for us. It's an oath of loyalty, to the club and to the brothers. That oath doesn't die when a man does. It lives on. It extends to his blood. We failed him. We lost track of you and we let you fall. We let the wolves get to your door. What we did tonight, this was us making it right. This was us honoring our code. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes fierce and sincere. In our world, Clara, loyalty is the only currency that truly matters. We don't have many of us, but we have our word and we have each other's backs. Your father was our brother. That makes you our famille. It's as simple and as complicated as that. Just then Leo emerged from his room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He had been put to bed hours ago, but the commotion had woken him. He saw Grizz sitting at the table, his sister smiling through her tears, and he knew. He knew the storm had passed. Grizz smiled at the boy. He reached into his vest and pulled out something small. It was a patch, newly stitched. It was a miniature version of the Iron Saint's snarling bear insignia. Leo, Grizz said, beckoning him over, I have something for you. He handed the patch to the boy. You're not a member, he said seriously. That's a hard road, and one you'll choose for yourself, or not when you're a man. But you are one of us. You're a little saint. You showed more courage last night than most men show in a lifetime. This patch means you are under our protection. Forever. If you ever need anything from anyone with our colors on their back, you show them this. They will stop and help you. No questions asked. Leo took the patch, his small hands tracing the intricate stitching. It was the most valuable thing he had ever owned. It was a shield. It was a promise. It was a family crest. He looked up at Grizz, this giant of a man who had commanded a legion for him and did the only thing that felt right. He launched himself forward and wrapped his arms around the biker's thick waist in a fierce hug. Grizz was startled for a moment. Then his huge arms came up and enveloped the boy, patting his back gently. Over the boy's head, he met Clara's gaze. Her eyes were shining with a light he hadn't seen before. The light of hope. The long night was over. A new day was dawning. 5 years later. The Starlight Diner was gone, replaced by a soulless chain coffee shop. But the little apartment on Elm Street remained, a stubborn bastion of warmth and memory in a changing neighborhood. The paint was no longer peeling. The windows were new and draft-free. The faucet didn't drip. The building, owned and maintained by the Iron Saints, was a safe, clean, and happy home for all its residents. Clara, now 24, was no longer a waitress. She was a nurse. The club had insisted on paying for her schooling, an investment, they called it, in the family. She worked in the pediatric wing of the local hospital, her weary grace now transformed into a confident, compassionate competence. She moved through the brightly colored hallways with a purpose that came from healing, not just surviving. The dark circles under her eyes were gone, replaced by a radiant smile that she no longer had to force. Her mother was healthy. The pneumonia, once a death sentence, had been beaten back by the proper medicine and care. She now volunteered at the local library. Her quiet strength returned. The worry had finally left her eyes. And Leo. Leo was 15, tall and lanky, with the same serious expression, but it was now one of concentration, not fear. He was at the top of his class, a star on the debate team, with a fierce intelligence and an unshakable moral compass forged in a single desperate night. He still had the patch. He kept it in a small wooden box on his desk, a reminder not of the darkness, but of the light that had come to vanquish it. The Iron Saints were a constant, wonderful presence in their lives. They were a legion of gruff, leather-clad, fiercely protective uncles. Grizz was at every one of Leo's debate tournaments, his massive frame taking up 2 seats in the school auditorium, his face beaming with pride. Reaper, the silent sergeant-at-arms, had taught Leo how to change the oil in a car. Doc helped him with his biology homework. They showed up for birthdays and holidays, their rumbling engines a familiar, comforting sound on the street. They had become, in every way that mattered, family. One crisp autumn afternoon, Grizz sat with Clara and Leo on their small balcony, drinking coffee. "You know," Clara said, looking out over the street, "I sometimes think about that night, about how scared I was, about how I almost told you I couldn't afford that burger." "But you didn't," Grizz said, his voice a low rumble. "You chose kindness. You threw a pebble in a pond, girl. You had no idea the ripples it would make." This story isn't really about bikers, is it? It's not about the leather, or the tattoos, or the roar of 100 engines splitting the night. This is a story about the unseen connections that bind us all. It's about how the smallest act of grace, a $5 kindness offered from a place of poverty, can be a spark that ignites a forest fire of loyalty and love. It's a story that proves that family is not always the one we are born into. Sometimes, it's the one that claims us, the one we earn through courage and build with promises kept. We are taught to judge by appearances, to see a uniform of worn leather and ink and feel fear. We are taught that heroes wear capes and ride white horses. But this story reminds us of a deeper truth. Heroes don't always wear shining armor. Sometimes they wear vests with the names of their fallen brothers stitched over their hearts. Sometimes saviors have grease under their fingernails and the dust of 1,000 lonely miles on their boots. They are the silent guardians, the keepers of forgotten promises, the quiet giants who stand as a wall between the vulnerable and the wolves of the world. So, who was the protector in your life? Who was the person who stood up for you when you couldn't stand for yourself? Tell us in the comments below, because these stories need to be told. They are the fuel that keeps hope alive. And if this story moved you, if you believe in the power of loyalty and the family we choose, then hit that subscribe button. Join our family. Ride with us. Stand with us as we continue to share stories of the quiet heroes who walk among us every single day. Tell us where you are watching from so we know how far these ripples are spreading. Because in the end, we are all just looking for our tribe, our own Iron Saints, to have our backs when the world turns cold.